US election. This is the context in which science happens. As part of its recommitment to combating systemic racism and other forms of discrimination, the International Science Council, the largest global science organisation in the world, has convened this roundtable, and we hope to, in the course of an hour, look at what we mean by systemic racism, how it manifests in science and science systems, and what areas international science organisations can focus on to break down the walls of systemic racism in these systems. Thankfully, I have an esteemed panel to help me in this endeavour, bringing their unique perspectives from academia, public and medical health, politics, human rights, and much more. So I will say before I introduce them that I'm very mindful that my brief introduction of the panellists by no means does them justice. So please head to the Falling Walls website for a fuller picture of their accomplishments. But I'd love to start in alphabetical order, introducing Anthony Bogues, Director of the Centre for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. Anthony is a writer, curator and scholar, and has written extensively on African and African diaspora, political theory and intellectual history. I'd also like to introduce Adam Habib, Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Witwatersrand, a Professor of Political Science. Adam is an academic, researcher, activist, administrator, and is incoming Director of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Welcome to you, Adam. We also have Tallulah Oni, Clinical Senior Research Fellow with the Medical Research Council Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge School of Clinical Medicine. Tallulah is a public health physician and urban epidemiologist. Her work supports a coordinated approach between science, policy and societal role players, identifying creative and long-term strategies to address complex urban health challenges in rapidly growing cities. Welcome, Tallulah. And finally, we have Mary Robinson, patron of the International Science Council, former President of Ireland and Chair of the Elders. Mary also served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002, is a member of the Club of Madrid and the recipient of numerous honours and awards. I could most certainly go on. Welcome to you all. Before we begin, there's also another very important panel member, and that is you, everyone watching live. We warmly invite you to participate in this discussion via the live chat function to the bottom right of your screen, where you can post questions for the panellists throughout this discussion, and I will endeavour to ask them either through the discussion, depending on how many questions come in, and we'll certainly have time at the end. So it's difficult to know just where to start, but perhaps we could begin by getting an idea of what we mean when we talk about systemic racism and what it might look like in science and science systems. Anthony, as someone who's written extensively about the evolution of knowledge and science systems, perhaps we can start with you to provide us with a bit of context. And I feel like there's still this fallacy that science is objective and immune to implicit and explicit bias. Taking a historical perspective, how do we know that this is not the case?
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good night to the audience, wherever you are. In trying to respond to that specific prompt, I think it's perhaps important to begin to think very briefly historically about the two things, the emergence of science and the actual emergence of race itself. One of the first persons to begin to theorize what race meant was this fellow called Immanuel Kant, who I'm sure lots of people know of, in the 18th century, where what he was trying to do was to think about how do I tell a story of the history of human beings through the history of the human race, but also tell it in a way which would de-link it from divine will and link it to questions of natural history. He was, of course, responding to Linnaeus's book of 1730s around the system of nature. But what is interesting is that as he began to do this, and Linnaeus was also in his work, System of Nature, was doing this, was that he also began to set up classificatory schemas. And so by the time Kant delivered his 1781 lectures on the different human races, he had created a classification schema in which he says, and here I quote him, the Negro race had no real character. So my argument here is really simple, is that the emergence of science, the godding of the world, the ways in which science was beginning to think both of nature and of quote-unquote man, really happens in a way or in conjunction with a set of ideas and a set of practices that have to do with the emergence of race itself. Why? Because all of this occurs within a discursive historical context of European colonial empires, racial slavery, and the conquest of the New World with the dispossession of the indigenous people. So what you really have is a kind of symbiotic relationship between the emergence of science and the emergence of the idea of race within the regimes of knowledge that are embedded within the colonial and racial projects of Europe. So what that means is that the so-called science of man really becomes racial science, and then becomes what would call the science of race. And when you begin to think about the emergence of things like evolution and biology and questions around trying to think about the environment, what was then called the torrid zone, what you begin to see is that the mapping of these questions are mapped upon some kind of classificatory schema, in which race plays a very important role. So in the end, therefore, the history of science is not separate from the history of race and science. And so that we have to begin to think about that relationship in a very important way. In the end, what that means, I think, is that there are two things. One is to think about race and science is to think about the question of representation. That is, who is doing science? How does race bar some people from doing science? And that's one question, what I like to call a representation question. But there's also the question of the knowledge regime. In other words, what is the relationship between race and science itself? I just want to end with a particular anecdote to show what I mean. It's not really an anecdote, it's from an article that was published in 2007 at the Institute of Mental Health and of Science in the United States. And it was an article published around HIV, AIDS. And the author, who's a well-known scientist from a university, begins the article by making the claim that AIDS or HIV essentially begins in the Congo. But then he steps from there to begin to talk about how Haitians were in the Congo, and Haitians were in the Congo, particularly in the 1960s, after the Patrice Lumumba regime, and that the ways in which it then spread itself to the New World, AIDS, is that these Haitians came back to Haiti. What is interesting about that is that we have no kind of empirical proof of it, but that the actual consequences of this kind of article created a policy in which Haitians then became stereotyped. And so that they were seen as primarily as persons who were carriers of AIDS. And that had enormous consequences for immigration policies in the United States. The purpose of me telling this story is that, therefore, is to talk about how the frame of our knowledge, how frames of knowledge regimes in which there are classificators, hierarchical systems that are embedded in race, how those things actually shape science and have really very, very important consequences for policies. But not only does it have important consequences for policy, it also shapes actually how we study the human subject.
Thank you, Anthony. I think that is absolutely given us perspective on kind of the system that we've inherited. Adam, I'd kind of turn it over to you. As Vice Chancellor of Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, I think you have a unique and hands-on perspective of what we have inherited and how we transition away from that, kind of picking up Anthony's questions in terms of representation. Who is doing the science in a university system and the relationship between race and science in a university context? Would you mind picking it up from there?
Sure. Let me start by reflecting a little on what I think the manifestations of racism are in the science system. And I want to highlight four. The first, which Anthony picked up on, is representation. There are people of particular racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds that are predominantly within the scientific community and represented within the scientific community, and others are not. And that's one manifestation of it. The second manifestation of it, which Anthony again touched on around knowledge systems, one is who determines the kinds of big research questions that receive the kinds of resources for investigation, and what kinds of knowledge systems, cohorts of knowledge actually surface within the institutions of science, whose stories get told, if you like. That's the second manifestation. And again, it seems to me those research questions and whose stories get told, if you like, reflect some parts of the human community and not others. And then the third, if you like, with symbolic expressions in the science system, who do we celebrate? What symbolic expressions we reflect upon and we build is also very skewed by reflecting some parts of the human community and not others. And it seems to me that creates huge problems of alienation for students, for learning, for the kinds of knowledge that gets produced, etc. Now, the question you pose is what can we do about it? And I want to highlight two particular, if you like, lines of inquiry. The first is I worry about the debate being constructed in polarized typologies. Universities are neoliberal institutions that reflect the elite, or they're transformed institutions. That's not reflective of the real state of affairs in institutions. I mean, I'll just take the example of South Africa. Wits University, where I was at 25 years ago, had students, 70% of its students were white. In 2020, 83% of those students are black. In 1994, at least 5% of the academics were black. In 2019, for the first time in our history, 52% of our academics are black. This institution has changed in fundamental ways. Now, is it enough? No, absolutely not. The fact that we had fees must fall, the fact that we have had students who claim to still feel alienated is a reflection that not enough is done. But what we've got to see transformation as is a never-ending process of continuous inclusion, and inclusion in its multiplicity of ways. The final line of inquiry I want to put onto the table, and we'll come back to it later, is I don't think we can have this debate solely in institutional and national terms. That's how we have this debate. But all of our challenges are transnational in character. This COVID-19 pandemic is a demonstration of it. Climate change, inequality, social and political polarization, all of that are transnational challenges, and we need institutional capacity and human capabilities across the world to be able to address them. But our higher education system works by attracting talented people from the developing world, taking them to London and New York and Beijing, and then many of them don't return, and we weaken the institutional capacities, and we weaken the challenge of human capabilities. So it seems to me we've got to reimagine higher education and scientific endeavor so that it's cross-institutional, cross-national. We've got the digital technologies to enable that, but we don't have the political will, and we need to think through the business models and financial flows that can sustain such trans-institutional and transnational scientific endeavors. Because if we don't do that, we will not survive as a human species in the next 200 years. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, Adam, you raised some incredible points. There's kind of 4 points about how racism manifests, and also some ideas about how we change it, and an example from your own experience about the changes that can happen, noting that also there is always room for continuing this. And I think we'll definitely come back to this in terms of collaboration, and this to me is kind of radical collaboration in terms of really knocking down these walls of any kind of siloed operations. Tallulah, I'd love to bring you in here to get your take on this. I think from your experience in medical and public health, what's your understanding, the scope of how racism and discrimination manifests from your experience?
Thanks, Neela. So I think I want to share some fairly personal reflections and also reflections from others in my communities, my science communities, about the ways that this kind of more systemic discrimination manifests, and they often quite subtle. So I've got 5 points to make on that. So the first is around Adam mentioned very briefly the agenda setting and driving. In addition to who sets the agenda, what the agenda is. So an anecdote from that, for example, is a personal anecdote is wrote a piece, a commentary a few years ago on the importance of long-term prevention and primary prevention of non-communicable diseases on the African continent. And the comment I got back from a peer reviewer was, oh, but Africa's got more pressing problems right now and can't afford to be thinking long-term. And I thought, who's setting that agenda? And that does not kind of tally with my experience, and it just doesn't make any sense. And it surprised me. It surprised me that it surprised me, but it did surprise me in thinking, well, if this is the agenda that has been set, is it any wonder that perhaps some of the more forward-thinking initiatives are not necessarily being funded? So that was just to add an anecdote to the point that Adam made. The second point is around benefit of the doubt. And this is a very subtle thing, but the space that is created. So when we're talking about advancing new ideas and innovative thoughts, which is what science is all about, discovery, what is often ignored, but is definitely felt, is that benefit of the doubt. Because sometimes those thoughts and those ideas require these huge leaps in how we think. And the reality is we see this discrimination manifest in who we see as being given that benefit of the doubt. So I remember many years ago, one of the most simultaneously flattering and insulting comments I got back from a grant peer review was that this was clearly written by my supervisor. Despite the fact that that wasn't his topic area of expertise, it wasn't his focus area, but there was just it couldn't possibly have been used that wrote that. So that benefit of the doubt, and it did make me wonder whether if I looked or sounded or acted a different way, whether that benefit of the doubt would have been afforded me. The third point is the opportunity cost. So the key things I'm highlighting here really are quite systemic issues. So by opportunity costs, I mean the cost of the day-to-day battles that have to be fought in addressing the bottlenecks of advancing scientifically, navigating imbalances in access, and how the cost of that is something that we don't often focus on. And I can come back to that, but I just want to get through my points. The fourth point is around how we reinforce implicit biases. So in how the kind of things that we teach, the examples that we use, the knowledges that we privilege, that is one critical aspect of how we see systemic discrimination. And the last point, which is maybe I think Adam was alluding to a little bit, is science in the context of broader societal discrimination. Because the reality is often we think about science and scientists as being separate from wider society. You know, I find myself say this, and I catch myself when I say science and society. They're not two separate things. So when we talk about reforming the systemic issues within science, it really is not possible for us to do that in isolation without reflecting on the ways that the societal discriminations and persecutions that people have to navigate before they walk into the doors of the ivory tower. So those are the kind of the overarching types of issues that I've reflected on. I think I will end by saying three things. So we think about strategies in addressing those. It's really critical that we take a very intersectional and also intentional approach to doing that. And when I say science, I can see at least three approaches that we would need to focus on. So firstly, from an education and training perspective, in the curriculum, what do we teach? How do we position expertise where do we position expertise as lying? What knowledge do we privilege? That's really critical, because that's where we seed discrimination and implicit bias. The second is around innovation, which relates more to, I guess, the application of the scientific discoveries. Again, how we apply and how we search for those, and how we define and how we celebrate those, I think Adam alluded to, is really critical. And the third, which is very close to my heart because I am an academic, is in research. So when I say research, is both in the context of our approach and focus of new knowledge. Public health, for example, is a good example of that. We're very guilty of that. We talk about looking at the effect of race on health outcomes. It's the effect of racism, right? That's what we're measuring. The construct is race that we measure, but what is much more difficult to nuance is a systemic racism that drives those inequalities. And we see that laid very bare in the context of COVID outcomes and inequalities, where we see across the board low, middle, high income countries, where you see this unaccounted for differences in outcomes, even after controlling for deprivation, even after controlling for some of the other better known kind of socioeconomic and other factors. So that's one. The second is in how we evaluate ideas. It's really great for me when I hear about, say, funding mechanisms that are trying to address the systemic discriminations and institutional biases. But the reality is, it's great to have those funding mechanisms in place, but really critical to implementing and operationalizing those ideas is who is evaluating those. So if we're not reforming our peer review body, we have the same implicit biases being applied to what could potentially be a different approach. So that would need to be reformed. And lastly, the peer review of publications. And really, I think addressing those last 2 points requires that we take a systems approach, because we can't just say, right, let's get more peer reviewers, let's get more diverse. It's like, well, in order to do that, we have to understand why people are not participating and addressing that opportunity cost. Because if you don't address those barriers, you're just adding additional additional load that people cannot afford to take on. I feel like I've spoken for a long time.
Yeah.
I will end by...
It was all so interesting. I didn't want to kind of step in, but probably you have covered a lot. I feel like you've covered a lot of ground there, and there is a lot to pick up. But I really want to invite Mary Robinson to come in here and harness some of your expertise, a life's work really in leadership and looking at this in terms of human rights and how it affects us all. I'd love to hear your comments on what's been shared so far.
Well, first of all, it's a great panel, and I'm very happy to be on it. And I was actually very pleased that the ISC, which I'm a patron of, issued that statement after the killing of George Floyd on combating systemic racism and other forms of discrimination. My first full-on experience in tackling racism was when I served in the United Nations as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. My most difficult task was to be the Secretary General of the World Conference Against Racism in September 2001. There had been 2 previous attempts to have a world conference and they failed. And this one nearly failed. It was held in Durban, South Africa. In the street, there was a linking of what was happening in Israel-Palestinian issues and conflict, using apartheid and addressing and having anti-Semitism, particularly in the civil society statement that was being prepared. And I actually, as High Commissioner, had to criticize the civil society statement for its anti-Semitic content while encouraging civil society in many other respects. That conference succeeded, which many people don't realize, in having a declaration and program of action, which the UN still follows up on. But that happened 3 days before the terrible attacks of 9/11, and partly because the United States and Israel had withdrawn, and the European Union almost withdrew, but we persuaded them to stay, and we got the result of the World Conference, but it was completely wiped from memory, and what was remembered was anti-Semitism, and I got criticized, although I was desperately trying to tackle that, of course. So that's the first thing. That taught me a lot of what Tolu was saying about the intersectionality of the different kinds of racism. And those I now talk about in a different context, but I think it's relevant. And when I talk about climate justice, what do I mean? I mean 5 layers of injustice. The injustice that climate change disproportionately and much earlier affects the poorest countries, the poorest communities, indigenous communities, and small island states. They, frankly, are the black and brown and indigenous people in our world. So there is that racism that is, part of that particular injustice. Secondly, the injustice of gender, the different social roles, the lack of rights in many countries, including land rights or access to credit of women who still have to put food on the table and go further in drought for water and so on. The third injustice is the intergenerational injustice, which thankfully the children have reminded us of so vividly. The fourth injustice is the injustice of the different pathways to development of industrialized and developing countries. And that is a lot to do with colonialism. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel, and now we have to wean ourselves off and do it with just transition, remembering the workers and their communities that helped us build our economies. But what about developing countries? I was the special envoy of the Secretary General for the Paris Climate Agreement, and I saw developing countries promise in their nationally determined contributions that they too wanted to be as green as possible. But they said, we will need the investment, we will need the technology, we will need the skills. And of course, we didn't show that solidarity. Meanwhile, a number of developing countries have found gas and oil and even coal. What are they to do? They have to take their people out of poverty. And if they do go the dirty route, if I can put it that way, then they will be the first affected, but we will all be affected because it will use up the carbon budget. But we're still not seeing that link being made. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. So I just wanted to lay that out because I have really understood the intersectionality And what has COVID done? It has totally brought this home. It has exacerbated all the inequalities and made them so rawly evident. It is people of color, it is black and brown people who live in polluted areas, who breathe polluted air, all of these issues have become much more clear. And I think what we need to do in a climate sense is link also all the ways in which people are rising up on the climate issue. So Black Lives Matter, Fridays for Future, the 350.org, all of these need to link more with social movements in our world. And the last point I'll make at this stage, because I, again, don't want to speak for too long, I feel as passionate as the other panel members, it may intrigue you, but I am learning so much from a podcast, which I'm now one of the hosts of. Another host is a much younger Irish woman who's a professional comedian in New York, Maeve Higgins, and Tamale, our third host, the producer, is from Sri Lanka. The podcast is called Mothers of Invention. Our byline is that climate change is a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution. Now, I always explain that man-made is generic, it involves all of us, and a feminist solution hopefully involves as many men as well as women as possible. But we speak to women mainly from the South, both within the United States and globally, and they talk all the time about colonialism and patriarchy. And these issues are so live for them. It's really, really instructive. And I recommend, because there's a lot of humor in it, that you have a look at the Mothers of Invention. And we did something for our last podcast, the last in the series, the last in this third series, which hasn't yet, and I even know the technical term, hasn't yet dropped. You see, I'm an elder, but I've learned about podcasts. And it will drop, I think, probably round about now. And we handed over to young climate scientists, to Shea Bastida and other young, an 18-year-old from Mexico, who's now based in the United States as a student, leading a whole group of young climate activists. She and her colleague took over. Our colleague was a comedian to replace my friend Maeve. And they did a brilliant program. But what we were doing was we were making space. We were giving them the place at the table, letting them determine the agenda. And that's important. I'll just stop there.
Yes, thank you. As moderator, I put my hand up. I've completely failed in terms of reining people in, but it really speaks to how passionate our panelists are about these topics, how important they are, and also how complex. I'd really like, I feel like we've got this picture now from your different perspectives about how this is playing out, how systemic racism and discrimination is playing out in all these different areas, and we're going from the very implicit, subtle, manifestations that we see to very obvious in terms of representation. I'd really love to get to some concrete steps to really kind of think, what can we do about this in really practical terms? Because I think there is such a divide between policy and practice and really putting things in motion. So I'd really invite you to think about, like if we were to get to a place where we were effectively combating discrimination in science, how do we get there? What are some key steps? Maybe Anthony, I turn it back to you. What are some key steps that we can put in place that we can take away from this discussion?
I think, thanks. I think one of the things that we want to think about is actually, quite frankly, questions of definition, because there is a problem, which one of our panelists referred to, in thinking about race, but not thinking about anti-Black racism, for example. And not beginning to realize that when we have phrases like implicit bias, that these are perhaps polite, perhaps a polite phrase for thinking about kind of ways in which structural anti-Black racism works within our own, just within our own particular field. So for me, the question always, it revolves firstly around how are we defining the problem? Because without the definition of the problem in a way that I think makes sense, then obviously what you do is that you're spinning your wheels. So after defining the problem, then to me the question then becomes, the two things that I've heard people say. One is that of representation. So what are the mechanisms? What are the ways in which you are going to encourage in universities and high schools and so on to have a different stream of persons who will think about science? I mean, I'm thinking about, for example, persons I know, somebody who's a brilliant economist, but who, when you speak to her, she's Black, when you speak to her and you ask her what she really wanted to be, she would say to you, I really wanted to be a zoologist, but I couldn't because my teacher said to me in high school that that's not for Black people, that's not for a Black girl, you better try and think about doing something else. And that doesn't just happen. That's just 1980 or 1990. That happens in the 21st century, where young Black kids come to me and say, this is, I want to be this, but this is what I was told in high school. How do I make a switch into studying some, whether it is computer science or whether it is zoology, or indeed whether it is medicine? So one question is about representation, is about what are the mechanisms that we will have from high school upwards that make sure that particularly young Black women are able to enter into the science field. And then the second one is really something that I find that we need to really pay attention to. That is what it is that we teach. And here I'm speaking as someone who teaches in a university, obviously. What does your curriculum look like? It's not just a question of celebration, that's part of it, or who you celebrate, but how do you teach what it is you teach about science? How do you teach what you have to teach in relationship to about science, in relationship to questions of racism and so on? How do you teach? And here, and let me get a concrete example. How do you teach, for example, in the medical school, and you're going to teach anatomy, and you're going to teach the history of anatomy and so on, without not teaching the ways in which some of the premier medical schools in the United States built their departments of anatomy, and also the kind of experiments they did on cadavers, on dead slaves, and the kind of ways in which those things, slaves were not seen as human, but they actually became the cadavers in which medical science did their work on. How do you teach in which science or medical science in which basically you don't carry an attitude that says somehow, and here I'm speaking about United States, coming out of the COVID experience in particular, that you don't teach that essentially Black women do not suffer as much pain as other people, and therefore when a woman comes into a clinic to be diagnosed, you say, she says, I'm feeling pain. You kind of look askance as a clinician. So that to me, one of the fundamental questions at the university is really about the transformation of that kind of knowledge, that kind of knowledge regime that would then create better diagnostic, that would create a different way for people to begin to think about, the treatment of human beings. But those are the things I want to talk about, because those things come out of immediate experience, which I've had over the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. So take away from that kind of representation and looking at how we increase, look at those mechanisms for increasing diversity and representation, and also looking at how we teach and what we teach. Okay, who'd like to pick it up from there in terms of their key concrete steps? That's an Adam I'm seeing. Yep. Was that
so
you? Yep.
Yeah, sure. So let me raise two sets of issues. It seems to me that there are both institutional interventions that can be made, and then there has to be societal intervention. So, I think South African universities and science institutions have gone a fundamental shift in the last 20 years in many ways around issues of representation, who comes in, how they come in, etc. In part, a large amount of that has got to do with the fact that we in the midst of a democratic transformation. None of this would have been possible without the broader political and societal transformation unleashed by our democratization and unleashed by the transformation unleashed as a result of the overthrow of apartheid. So I want to first make that point that others have made, that it's absolutely, you can't think of scientific institutions and deracializing, if you like, science without thinking of deracializing society. So that's the first point I want to make. The second is, having said that, it seems to me that there are very, very concrete institutional interventions you have to make. So at Wits University in 2014, the first thing that we did is, as Vice Chancellor, I wrote a collective piece after big consultation across the institution around how we're going to combat racism and how we're going to deracialize this institution. And it was a critique of what was at least a tradition in science, a colorblind tradition, which says we now don't, which doesn't realize that the past still lives with us, and we have to actively combat racism in multiple ways. Second is, we then put forward a series of plans. We put money that we had raised and effectively decided to appoint, to bring in to the academy a series of new appointments of African and what in South African terminology we call colored people of mixed ancestry, and particularly women. And what we were scared of is, often we've done that in South Africa, but they get appointed for 3 years and then they move on. And so what we did is we tied that to retirements. And so these could be permanent appointments. That was the first intervention. The second intervention is, we found that people who came in got terrible teaching loads, did a large amount of administration, and never were promoted because they were never given an enabling environment. So we identified people and we custom made a program for each one of them. We sat down with somebody in engineering and said, what is your particular challenge, so that we can enhance your research productivity, your teaching productivity, so that you get promoted. And that person would say, I need support grants for my postgraduate students because I can't do my research without my postgraduate students. Somebody else would say, I've got a real problem around childcare. Can you help me out with childcare so that I can get and pay attention? And we custom made solutions to that in quite powerful ways. And we shifted the game plan. Now, I do want to say, none of this happens without money. If you don't have money, you can't do this, which means you have to think about how you mobilize money. And if you're going to find money, you've got to make sure that that funding is sustainable. And the third and final thing that I do want to say, that there's been a strong tradition of in South Africa, is symbolic expression. So we've got all of our buildings are going through new naming. And we've been very careful at Wits not to take, frankly, white politician buildings named after white politicians and replace it with buildings named after black politicians. What we wanted is we wanted naming and symbolic expression to unite. So multiple languages, multiple disciplines, ensure that naming happened after women and men, ensure that you reflected authors and artists. And so in a sense, you create a nuanced environment where affirmation happens in a scientific institution. Now, I think that there's enormous lessons to be learned. I think South Africa is interesting because it was such an incredible social laboratory over 20 years. There are lessons to be learned there by the developing world, by the way, because I think the developed world has been too comfortable. It's been too comfortable in its elitism and in its and
Absolutely.
complacency.
Adam, I'm gonna come in here. I completely agree with you, and thank you so much for those contributions. I'm very mindful of the time. I wish we had 2 hours to get to all of this, and I would really like to open up to some audience questions. I can see that a couple of audience questions have come in, so they're actually to Mary and Tallulah. So maybe we could answer these audience questions and integrate your key steps at the same time. But I just want to quickly summarize what Adam said before moving on in terms of these concrete interventions. He looked at putting a plan forward and then actioning that plan and then mobilizing this plan with money and really tailoring interventions to individuals to make sure that they were very active in increasing the diverse representation. Tallulah, I've got a question for you from the audience. It says, Tallulah touched upon the opportunity cost, the burden of combating discriminations falling to those at the receiving end, taking away from the time and energy they could be putting into their work. How do we distribute this burden and build science systems and processes that support and protect us?
Thanks. So thanks for the very straightforward, easiest question. It's such an important point, and thank you for bringing that up. One word: power. That is because in as much as we have to confront racism, we also have to confront what power means. And by power, I mean both who has it and how it's used. And by how it's used, I don't necessarily mean positively or negatively. I mean the process of understanding how to use it. So I often say, I would love to see a world in less need of heroes, because we talk about heroes, and I just actually have a problem with the valorizing of the blood, sweat, and tears. We have valorized that, somebody has come through against all odds and has made it and is now at Harvard University. And we have less of why in the 21st century, in a rich country, do we have somebody who had to go through education hungry, who had no support for mentorship, and those are more fundamental questions that we have to address, because often by the time you've actually got to a position, what you have given up to get there means that your resilience is somewhat compromised. So in our thinking of creating these enabling environments, how are we redistributing power? Is something that is fundamentally important to ask. And I liked Adam's example of asking the questions of what do you need? Because the other aspect of power is we hold on to it because we know how to distribute it, rather than giving the benefit of the doubt to say, the beneficiaries might know best how to do it. And so you give them the benefit of the doubt to say, I'm not going to say that you have to use it on a grant or because maybe it's childcare. And so related to Adam's point is the pipeline. So also when we talk about these inequalities in science, are we talking as a whole, or are we talking about every step of the way from undergraduate to representation right through to faculty and senior management? Because it's really important, because we also know that there's one thing about discrimination and inequalities and entry, but also at every step of the way, it's a very leaky pipeline. And so when we think about supporting that, addressing those opportunity costs will require relinquishing some of the power that often is tied in with money. I want to say one other thing, which also speaks to representation and the power of those subtle, because this is also relates to the opportunity cost of the day-to-day. I'm going to say something really uncomfortable here. At the start of this session, we had a video played about this conference, which was really great. However, the representation of the people in that video, I'm sorry to say, was largely white male. And I don't know if that was something that was noticed, but almost I could count the number of people who weren't white males that were in that video, and that wasn't a lead up to a session about systemic discrimination in science. So when we talk about representation, no aspect is excused. So how are we measuring and how are we holding ourselves accountable, right? So it's not a virtue of whether you're a good person doing good thing. You know, you might be doing good thing in one place and not, you know, being sufficiently reflexive in another. So those are the kind of very day-to-day things that you're confronted with that instill in you that these are the people, this is what the people, when you've made it, this is what you look like, that really need to be dismantled. And then the final point I will make, if you excuse me, is the importance of spaces of connecting communities and spaces of experimentation. Because some of the most experimental and innovative approaches to thinking about this discrimination issues that I've come across have been within the Global Young Academy community, which I'm proud to be part of. That in addition to the anti-discrimination statement that was released in the Northern Summer around the George Floyd killings, have actually confronted thinking about discrimination around how you recruit and how you evaluate, have confronted thinking about societal discrimination, so looking at young scholars at risk who are displaced and how you actually connect migrant scholars in communities, and really just safe spaces where you could experiment in ways that are not where you don't have those platforms in our day-to-day. So we have these safe spaces of communities where we, as a building that community, can say, how do we do it differently? Because this is a space where we create, and how do we do it differently? So I can't emphasize enough the importance of the creation and supporting of those spaces.
Thank you. And I think, you know, in terms of concrete steps, you raise a really important one that links to what a lot of the panelists saying, was in terms of like combating this implicit bias. It really starts with us and opening our eyes and really being very self-reflective, because as much as we talk about systems, they're made up of people and individuals. So that's a really important takeaway, I think. Now, I'm again mindful of time, but Mary, a question has come in for you, which is questions about perspectives from your life's work as a political leader, bringing focus and action on discrimination and injustice. What are the key ingredients of an anti-racist and social justice approach that has brought about lasting change?
Well, first of all, I would just like to say that I too had noticed that the video seemed to lack diversity. So I think there has to be that sense of justice and the dignity of people. I mean, I take my sort of moral compass on human rights from the beginning of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And I think we need to think a lot more about what dignity means. And dignity does mean representation. It does mean seeing people like me in positions that I aspire to. It does mean all of those things. And if you're homeless and lying in a doorway and people pass you by without even seeing you, it's very hard to have that dignity. So, you know, it's hard to answer a question like that, you know, effectively from a personal position. When I was elected the first woman president of Ireland, I felt very strongly that I had to present and show that I actually thought it was an advantage to be a woman. I wasn't going to try to be like a man. I was going to do it as a woman, walk tall as a woman, because I felt the qualities of women's leadership that I was aware of would help me greatly. The qualities of being problem solving, of being collaborative, of listening, of having an empathy and real concern for those that you serve as a leader, and leadership is service. All of those things would be better rather than otherwise. And when I became High Commissioner for Human Rights, I had so many issues to learn and to learn about, and most of all, to learn about systemic racism, about the loss when you don't have diversity in all its forms. And it's amazing how colorblind, genderblind, system blind we can be. That's the truth of it. So it's a sort of long journey to work for justice, to work for human rights, to work for equalities of all kinds and opportunities of all kinds. And you have to make space for people, which I was trying to show in our Mothers of Invention, just handing over to young climate activists. When I was working on the lack of gender and human rights in the whole approach to the climate change in the COPs that I would attend, we had to form a network of women leaders on gender and climate to make space for women of color, young women, indigenous women, to be able to get access to where the delegates were by being delegates. They were very active in the civil society space, but the delegates never went there. But we had ministers who formed part of their delegation, would be young people, grassroots women, women of color, and those voices at the table made a huge difference because they were speaking from frontline experience of what climate change really meant. And the delegates that were so busy with the technical phrases and arguing points endlessly were quite taken aback to hear that fresh, authentic voice speaking about something you've lived. And we need to hear more people speaking the lived experience of systemic racism at the right tables in the right way, and have no inhibitions about doing so, because we need to learn.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mary. What would be great, because I think we've looked at, what we've inherited, the history of this. We've looked at the artificial divisions when there's so much integration in terms of how this all works, in terms of seeing science as embedded in society, made up of individuals who have our own accountability with this. What would be great in our last, 2 minutes is really to leave it with a bit of hope. So if I kind of ask you if you could maybe answer in one sentence, if that's possible, just one takeaway that can give us hope that we can do this, that we can combat systemic discrimination in science. One thing that gives you hope. Adam?
Look at South African institutions. They've changed fundamentally in 20 years. Now we need to do more, but it shows it can be done.
Thank you. Tallulah? I
think I would reiterate my last point is the communities of young but early, mid, and established scientists that are experimenting and creating different spaces. So it gives me a lot of hope to be a part of those spaces, because we have people who are working across boundaries, across silos, be that disciplinary, geographical, institutional, to really grapple with these challenges and to play and to experiment with other ways of being. So that for me is a really uplifting path. So we just have to find a way to mainstream these innovations and not have them as separate to the main institutions.
Absolutely. Mary?
Well, sorry, I have to unmute, I think.
Oh, no, we can hear you.
Well, I can hear. As chair of the elders, I have to bring hope, because we were brought together by Nelson Mandela to work on peace and human rights and sustainable development, but also to bring hope. And I learned from Archbishop Tutu. I was on a panel with him some years ago, and he was accused of being an optimist because he was in front of young people and, waving his arms and loving them. And the moderator, she said quite sharply, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" And he said, "Oh no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And I think that's important, because if you're a prisoner of hope, the glass may not be half full, but you see something in that glass you can work on. And that's what we have to do in combating something as systemic and blind to many of us as racism. We have to look around and see, how can we make this group that I'm in more diverse? How can I make space for somebody else to have a voice who otherwise mightn't? It's asking those questions constantly about how to make sure that we really have that diversity that's so important.
Absolutely. And finally, last words to Anthony. You started us off, and could you finish us, please, with your words of hope?
The words of hope are really not so much my words, but trying to understand the world we live in. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, or which began in the United States, this program itself has been catalyzed by the horrible death of George Floyd. I think all the young people who were involved in that movement, the demonstrations that took place across the world, 4,000 cities, really gives me hope. Not even make me a prisoner of hope, but really allows hope, in fact, for us to realize that hope can be, in fact, be something that can change the world. And it is the young people who are doing that I think is and doing it with the verve, with trying to raise new ideas of how to do these things, that I think has made some kind of shift in a world in which in which there are now, I think, points of light, even though there are candles have been no longer exist in some of these places, that there are points of light, and those points of light have come from the young people, and they move social movements around the world, which is one of the reasons why we're having this today. We would not have had this today if there was no social movement, and that gives me hope in the social movements that are now catalyzing the world.
And our responsibility to keep this momentum going. Thank you all so much for giving up your time most generously and your expertise in participating in this today. I would also like to thank everyone who posed questions. Sorry if we didn't get to them all. I'd like to thank Falling Walls and the Berlin Science Week, an incredible team. Thank you for your support. And thank you to the International Science Council as well for making this discussion happen. Now, don't miss the next Falling Walls Circle table coming up at 6 p.m. Berlin time. I think that's in just under an hour. The topic is science communication in crisis. Could we do better? And of course, if you can't get to everything you want to see, every day at noon GMT, that's 1 p.m. Berlin time, Falling Walls and Berlin Science Week present the highlights of the day. All the details are accessible on the Falling Walls website. You can check out the entire program with over 200 individual events. For now, I'm Nuala Hafner. Thank you so much again to our panelists, everyone taking part, and enjoy your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Nuala.